This is our last chance to hop off of Singer's argument. Premise 3. Most of the citizens of affluent or wealthy countries, for example the U.S., are able to prevent the suffering and death from lack of food, etc., of children in other places, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral worth or importance. But they don't do so. Is that true? Is it true that most of us in this country and in other more affluent nations would have the ability? We could absolutely forego, watching TV as much as we do, buying as fancy as sofas as we do, putting brand new carpet in the house when the old carpet was just out of style. It wasn't anything wrong with it. We just got tired of looking at it. The paint to repaint the walls, the gas we put in the lawnmower to mow the yard, that wouldn't really matter either way. We just do it because the neighbors, everybody else is mowing their grass, so we spend our money for mowers and gas to mow our grass too. It's like, couldn't we forgo some of that and then give that money and it could be used to save children, or that time? Don't think it's just money. It's the time that we put into earning that money. It's the effort and labor that was put into it. Couldn't we give that stuff and actually save these most near invaluable and worthy things, little kids? Singer's going to say, yeah, we could. I mean, does people in here buy it? Does it seem plausible to think that many people in, say, this country could give up many luxurious things and in the process, save the lives of children to do so? Yeah, it seems plausible. But many people choose not to do that. That seems plausible too, at least to me. But everybody in here, you can think about it, see what you think. And if it does, though, if you buy that many of us could, in fact, save the lives of kids by sacrificing things that are not of the same worth and value, and we don't do it, if you buy into that and you think that's pretty much true, then you've accepted Singer's third premise. At that point, once you give him 1, 2, 3, or you think those 3 are true, you're at 4. Thus, most of the citizens in affluent nations, you, me, and most other U.S. citizens, we are terribly immoral. Every time we don't make those sacrifices, kids are dying. And that's on us. Why is it on us? Because we could have prevented it, but we chose not to. We could have saved particular children at particular times. Singer's not saying we save all of them. No, it's a matter of, as an individual that knows your own pattern of behavior, what you do in your free time, and what you do with your excess funds that go beyond securing basic needs for yourself and your family. Does it seem plausible to say that that stuff could have been spent saving the lives of children that are going to die horribly and have died horribly? Does it seem plausible to say, well, yeah, that's a pretty immoral thing to have allowed to happen? Yep. If so, well, then you bought into Singer's argument, and so what is the end result? Well, we'd be immoral. Every time we have chosen luxury over saving a child's life, preventing suffering in a child's life, we've acted immorally. And those things add up. This is like a pile that keeps growing of immorality. I mean, it's not, a laughable matter by any means, but it is. Sometimes there is a dark humor to the way this works out, where you're like, whoa, what a bill in terms of morality, in this case, immorality. Now, has Singer said anything else? Has his argument said anything beyond this? No. It just says that if we could have saved children by giving up nothing of we could have done it without giving up anything that's of anywhere near the same value, and yet we chose not to do it. Well, we're bad for having made that choice. morally bad. That's all his argument says. Now, if we have been giving up all of our access to save children all across the world, our individual children, as we have the resources, we direct them toward individual children and are saving them, keeping them alive, keeping them from suffering. If we've been doing that, then we're totally morally okay. That's all Singer's argument says. But the reality is, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this, many people do not like to think they have been acting immorally for not giving up their luxuries to save children. Why they don't want to be immoral? Personally, I don't know. It's just the nature of the way people tend to respond to Singer's argumentation. All his argumentation has said is that any time that we have bought excess when we could have just as soon saved the life of a child, and yet we chose to buy the excess anyway, which is nowhere near the worth of that child's life. Anytime we did that, we've been immoral. And a person could just accept that. That's an option at this point in Singer's argument. One could just say, yes, I've acted immorally. But it's an interesting thing that most people don't want to say that. They don't want to accept that. They want to say, no, it's not wrong. I have not done anything wrong by buying the latest video game and all the expansion packs, for the $60 plus another $20 to $40 to $50. And I got the figurines too, the action figures, It's like, the idea is many people in this country at least, tend not to want to think that they did anything immoral when they made those purchases. And that's exactly what Singer is saying they did. They did something terribly immoral. So people tend not to like that. So, not to be unexpected, there are many possible objections to Singer's reasoning. But keep in mind that an objection has any hope of defeating Singer's argument if it upends one of his reasons. So these objections, the only ones that really matter are the ones that might, in some way, let's go back up here to the argument. The only objections that really matter as far as the validity of Singer's argument are those objections that directly would show that either 1, 2, or 3 is false. Any objections that don't show that 1, 2, or 3, or some bundle of those is actually false, any objection that does not concretely demonstrate that has no influence whatsoever on Singer's argument. Now, Singer will reply. We're going to see this. We'll see the way he responds to many of the common objections raised against what he's saying. But keep in mind, the only ones that really have any hope of defeating Singer's argument are those that concretely demonstrate there is some falsity in 1, 2, or 3. Well, let's survey some of these objections. We may not go through all of them, but we will go through enough of them so that everybody has a sense of Singer's way of seeing the world and thinking. That's what's most important. We just need to be able to see the world through Singer's eyes so we can understand what he's saying, so that when we go to think about it and talk about it this week, everybody's on the same page. We don't need misunderstandings of what Singer's up to. It's fine if some of us, are a little confused about it. That's fine. We can work with that. But we do need to all be kind of on the same page with it. The first objection people will typically raise, even Singer raises this in Famine, Affluence, and Morality and responds to it in that article. If someone could say, we're only morally obligated to provide aid and assistance to those that are close to us and never to those living far away, while you or I may be morally obligated to help, say, American or U.S. children, we're not morally obligated to help those in foreign nations. That's an objection. It's like, okay, Singer, yeah, you keep implying that it's these kids all over the world, but why wouldn't we be morally obligated just to deal with the children closer to us first? Singer's response, the first thing is to say, well, why? What does distance from the child in need have to do with one's moral obligation to help? Look back at the drowning baby scenarios. Did it matter how far away you actually were from the drowning baby? As long as you have the ability to reach out to save the child, does it really matter how far away you are from the child? I mean, does morality seem to care? Does our moral obligation tend to fade because we add miles between ourselves and the drowning baby? While all the while we still have the means to reach out and pull the child out of the water. We could be doing it through a phone conversation, through the internet. This is one of the way that our technology locks us with Singer's argumentation is we all know that we have near instantaneous communication abilities today. That we can watch near real-time video that's happening live across the world and be talking back and forth with people that are doing something all the way across the world. So say we're 100 miles away from this child that's drowning in a puddle, and somebody gives us a call and says, hey, look at this. You see the child drowning in the puddle. I can't reach out to get them, but if you'll wire me, say, $10, I can run in the store and buy this pole to reach out there and get the child. Will you send me the money? See, the idea is we could reach out through the virtual world to that physical person and they could do this and save this child. So does distance seem to really matter anymore? Like our range of our reach has extended all the way around the globe. At any point in time, we could reach out. So why wouldn't our moral obligation be, well, you need to reach out to the kids that are suffering and dying, regardless of where they are? That's the way the response to distance objection works, is why would distance matter? Why would we have greater moral obligations to a child that's an inch from our hand than we would 2,000 miles from our hand when our hand, the reach of our hand is worldwide now? It was different if at a point in time when we could not know what's going on the other side of the world real time and interact with it real time. But today we can. So distance, that's the whole idea of things like the internet and cellular communication, is that distance doesn't really matter anymore. Not in terms of the range of our influence, that we can reach across the world due to technology. Well, that's made distance not matter morally either, according to Singer. But then some people may still not want to give up on that and say, this U.S. Kids First objection, that while we may be morally obligated to give up our luxuries in order to prevent the suffering and death of children, we are only morally obligated to do so for U.S. kids, not those in other nations. We should take care of our own first. And then if there's anything left, perhaps worry about others. So this is an objection that is typically offered by someone who buys into Singer's argument. They just don't buy into this, I need to be trying to save children across the globe. I mean, why not take care of our kids first and this nation first? Then if there's anything left over, worry about the rest of the world. This person, notice they're not disagreeing with Singer when they launch this kind of objection or question. It's more like, okay, yeah, I'm morally obligated to save, kids in this nation, but I don't buy that I'm supposed to save them in other nations. Well, what is Singer's response? It's actually interesting. Singer is a type of consequentialism. So for him, the way it's supposed to work is an action's moral, whenever it does the best for the most. It results, the consequences of that action are the best for the most. The majority of people affected by that action are made better off by it. Recall consequentialism. See, there's a reason we learned all that stuff in these previous weeks. It comes back. It's helpful. to understand the people we're encountering throughout the rest of the semester. That, see, as a consequentialist, Singer will say, at the way currency exchange rates are going, at the current rates, $1 given to help a child in the U.S. won't hardly feed that child for one day. Maybe it could be stretched, but typically not. Just think about how much food or whatever you could buy for $1 for one little kid. And that may keep that kid alive a day. Maybe. Just depends on how thrifty we were in the way we spent it and the quality of whatever food we were buying with it. But the idea is that's one kid, one day. That same U.S. dollar in some of these more impoverished countries, that same U.S. dollar could feed 5, 10, 20, 30 kids for a month. Yeah, and there are places that are like that. He's not wrong about this. That there are some countries where you could take $500 and live there a whole year. You could feed yourself and have excess and live the high life in those countries. Well, that is the core reasoning as consequentialist. It's like, in order to be moral, we should always be doing the best for the most. Well, the way we can do the best for the most, given current money exchange rates, is we can save and alleviate more suffering for children in other nations than in this nation. And so it's a kind of, morality would want us to get the most bang for our buck. That if it's a consequentialist style framework, it's always about doing the best for the most. Like, why save one kid in the U.S. when we could take that exact same amount of resource and save 50 kids in another country? Wouldn't the goal always be to help the most, especially if each and every child is this near inherently valuable entity? Well, then wouldn't we want to save as many of those as we could? And if, in fact, the best way to save as many as we can is by donating to children in other countries rather than the U.S., then that's what we should do. But Singer is a consequentialist. So if one could demonstrate and provide evidence that the best way to save the most children overall or prevent the suffering of the most children, the greatest number, remember, it's consequentialist, it's about that total number. If the best way to save the most children were to give to U.S. Kids First, and that can be established, then Singer would be fine with giving to U.S. Kids First. It's not, he points in the direction of children in other nations sheerly for consequentialist reasons. Namely, we want to do the best for the most. That's what matters morally. We can do best for most by donating to kids in other countries rather than our own, because in our country, you can't get a whole lot for your money. Whereas in other places, you can. For the same amount of money, you can get astronomically more in terms of alleviation of child suffering, harm, death due to lack of food, medical care, etc. So the idea is, he would say we don't pick U.S. Kids First to save because we can save way more kids somewhere else using the same amount of resources. But if that were to change in the future, Singer would be fine in saving U.S. kids. It's not a matter of saying U.S. kids aren't as important as those across the oceans. It's just to say that practically speaking, we can do more good over there in terms of children's lives and alleviation of suffering than we can currently do here for the same amount of resources. So just think about that. It's kind of interesting. Neat kind of response. Bystander's objection. This one we've already kind of alluded to, but it's the idea of sometimes people will say, yes, Singer, maybe your argument's right, but I'm not immoral. They try to deny his conclusion. They say, yeah, premise 1, 2, 3, they're all true, but I'm still not immoral because there's so many other people that aren't donating to do this. There's so many people that are not doing what your argument says they should be doing, Singer. So I'm no worse than they are. If it can't be bad to walk by and go watch TV rather than save the baby in the puddle, because there's so many other people that are doing the exact same thing. Their babies are drowning in puddles every day, and people are watching Netflix every night. It's like, so there's so many other people that are not doing this that it can't be immoral. Well, Singer's response to this is all that anyone has accomplished by pointing to all these other people that are not saving these babies and giving up their luxuries to do so, all that one's done is pointed to a whole bunch of other immoral people. One's not gotten him or herself off the moral hook or lost the moral responsibility to save any drowning babies within their reach just because other people aren't doing it. All that one has done is said, yeah, I'm bad if I don't save the child, and all those other people that are walking by, they're equally bad too. That just because other people don't do something doesn't make the doing of that thing any less morally obligatory. And maybe that there is some kind of neat way to make sense of this. That suppose that this happens sometimes with our children, where the kid's defense will be, you say, why did you do that? And say, well, everybody else was doing it. And then you're like, yeah, but you don't do what everybody else is doing just because they're doing. That's what this response is. The bystander's objection could be understood as, I did it because everybody else was doing it, and surely all of us couldn't be wrong, could we? And then Singer is like, yes, all of y'all could be wrong. Or think about it in another way. Say that you're in a city and there happens to be a riot that takes place, and there's people that have broken into a local store and they're running out with all these goods and products from the store. I mean, it's stealing. It's a form of theft. And the idea is, if you think theft is bad, does it make it any less bad just because a lot of people happen to be doing it right in front of you? Would it make it okay for you to join in to steal? I mean, assuming you consider stealing to be a bad thing, would it become a good thing just because you see a lot of other people doing it? Singer would say no. That if theft was bad to begin with, it doesn't matter how many people besides yourself are stealing. If you go join the crew, then you're stealing too. It's kind of like a group of people could do bad things. It's not like just because the numbers of people increase in an action that the morality or immorality of the action changes. According to Singer, at least. Is he right about this? I don't know. But it is an interesting way to respond to, it's got to be okay. Look at everybody else that's doing it. Singer's like, no, it's not that way. It's interesting. It's an interesting objection. And a reply. His reply is really interesting, too. Government responsibility. Yeah, like, isn't it the responsibility of the governments to deal with all these children that are starving and dying? That's not my responsibility as a citizen. It's not my responsibility to give up my luxury time to save children somewhere else. That's their government's responsibility, isn't it? Singer's response is like, well, we all know that no current governments are giving enough to save these kids. How do we all know this? Is because there's still starving and dying kids. That's how we all know it. Is we all know that there are kids that still starve, still die of exposure, and that still die due to medical care that could have been provided but wasn't. We all know that reality still exists in our world. We may not want to think about it on a day-to-day basis, but we do know it exists. And so the idea is that means that we would also know that governments are not solving that problem. Current governments aren't solving that problem. They may be giving tons and tons to try to do it, but they have not yet succeeded. And so the idea is it's not just the government's problem. That remember with that baby in that drowning puddle, if we bought into that, we know that we as individuals have part of this moral responsibility. No doubt governments may too, but Singer's argument is not directed at governments, it's directed at us as individuals. So if we have a moral obligation, well, maybe governments do too, but we still have the same moral obligation regardless of what governments are not doing. That changes our moral obligation not in the slightest. It just means that both the government and us have this responsibility. Singer's really neat. Okay, this is a neat objection. It's actually a really interesting one because it tries to turn consequentialism, which remember, Singer is a type of consequentialist. We saw that up above. But it tries to turn consequentialism against Singer. So this is a really interesting, this absurd consequence worst off objection. It's a kind of technical objection because it's using consequentialism, but it is neat. It asks this question, so like, what if everyone did what Singer demands? What if everyone gave all that they could to alleviate the suffering and death of starving kids? This would have the consequence of there being no starving kids. But what about, because, and think about that, kind of realistically, that children tend to make up about 25% of most nations. And that means there's 75% of the rest of the nation that is adult. They're 18 and above. And that's kind of a global statistic. It's not a perfectly global statistic. Children may make up a higher percentage overall out of the 7 or so billion people on the planet, but there are more adult people than there are children. So the idea is if every adult were to give as much as Singer eventually, says that we should be giving. And how much do we give? I haven't mentioned that yet. We give until we reach a point where our basic needs, till we would sacrifice something of comparable moral worth, which would be equivalent to I would have to give up my food and starve myself in order to save this next little kid from starving. Well, I don't have to make that trade, according to Singer's reasoning, that I could stop there. Remember, you're not morally obligated to give if doing so means you have to sacrifice something of comparable moral worth, namely your life or the life of one of your children, or your spouse's life, your immediate family. You do everything you can to secure their well-being in terms of food, shelter, clothing. But now we're not talking about fancy clothes, going out to eat at night, things like that. We're just talking about basic needs. If everything you have is going toward that, well, then you're not obligated to give. So, yeah, that's where this is coming from. This kind of objection is the idea, but yeah, if all the adults did that, there wouldn't be any starving, suffering kids. But what about all the adults that are driven into the poorhouse by giving all they had? Like, there are far more adults than starving children. As we just discussed, the world population is more adult than child. And if all the adults ended up starving or near starving, they wouldn't be starving. Singer lets you stop before you get to absolute starvation yourself, but it's right up to that point almost. It's like we have more people that are way worse off than we were when we started because adults make up more of the population. So now you have a majority that is made worse off by the whole globe following Singer's suggestions of giving what we can up to the point of what might sometimes call marginal utility. By giving down to that moment, if everybody were to do that, then we would end up with a situation where 20 to 30, 35% of the global population, we don't have starving, suffering children. But we have 65 to 70 to 75, 80% of all the adult population in the globe, this made significantly worse off. How can that be good on a consequentialist picture? Well, Singer's response to this is interesting. It's simple. Let's be realistic, please. If, in some imagined scenario, all the adults on the globe were to do this, as suggested by the person who launched this objection, then yeah, the globe might be made worse off in terms of total numbers. That if all the adults were to strip themselves down to marginal utility in order to save all the lives of all children across the land, then perhaps Singer admits in an imagined scenario like this, yeah, it could turn out where more adults are made worse off. But Singer is like, we have to be realistic. We all know that not all adults are ever going to follow what Singer's saying. Not everybody's going to do what his argument says we need to be doing, namely giving up our excess to save the lives of kids that are suffering. But everybody's not going to do that. Everybody's not going to be convinced by Singer's argument. Not everybody's even going to hear about Singer's argument, much less follow it. So in the real world, we never have to worry about this imagined scenario that this objection describes. So Singer's like, we don't have to worry about this objection. That we're not going to ever live in that world to ever have that happen, so we don't need to worry about it. So it's no reason to reject Singer's argumentation, because all it's trying to do is to help a few people along see maybe what morality needs them to be doing. That's all his argument's going to do, and it's only going to impact ever so many people in ever so much amount of time. It's very unlikely that it would ever become an entirely global phenomenon to ever do this. Now, if one could provide concrete evidence that everybody is moving in the direction of doing exactly what Singer is suggesting, and all the adult population is in fact declining themselves down to that marginal utility line, that one more donation would make them as bad off as the kids are saving. If concrete evidence could be provided that that is exactly what was happening, then Singer would back off. But there is no evidence for such a thing. If anything, the world we live in is evidence that that's not happening. That some people give, most don't. Not at the level Singer's talking about. So it seems perfectly fine for him to say, yeah, this objection is an imagined concern. It's not a real concern today. It might be one day, but it's not today, so we don't have to worry about it. Another objection is this: no one thinks that. While many would admit that it's probably a good thing to give to charity, no one thinks that we have a moral duty to do so, or that we have acted immorally by not doing so. This seems like a sort of everyday sort of response objection to Singer, is to say, Singer, no one thinks this way, so what you're saying can't be right. Singer's response is like, well, the fact that a lot of people may not think what they're doing is immoral, that really has no relevance on whether what they're doing is actually moral or immoral. So think about it like this. Historically, there's been a lot of nations and groups of people that have done things that none of them thought they were doing anything especially immoral. But then later down the line, people look back and say, whoa, that was bad. And they're not looking at it as that was bad just because they're at a future time. It's like when we look back, for example, at like examples of like mass genocide of whole groups of people, today we tend to say that's pretty bad. It doesn't really matter who was doing it or what their reasons for doing it were. It's like it just tends to be, yeah, that was bad. It was bad when they did it. It would be bad if we did it today. Like there's this timelessness, that hangs over the badness of genocide. And so this is kind of the way that Singer is just because a group of people today don't think that, just because most people don't think that something's bad, that really tells you nothing about whether it actually is bad or not. And moreover, people do actually think this way. That's the way Singer will turn this sort of objection against him, is he'll say, but when, keep in mind when we were reading through his argument earlier, that if you thought that it would be bad to walk away from that baby and let it drown so you could go buy ice cream instead, well, then Singer's going to say, you actually do think this way. It's not just Singer, some weirdo out here saying, weird things. No, it's like if you walk through his drowning baby example, well, then you've already been able to think this way too. So, in fact, some people do think this way. Maybe you do. And you just don't know it. But now you do. It's neat. Singer's way of responding is always interesting. This is also a common one, is people will say, well, Singer, I would donate and do this stuff, but you never know. These charities could be just taking your money. We know there's examples of charities, that even big name charities, where 99% of the money goes to the corporate offices and only 1% ever trickles down to the thing people thought they were giving money for. Or there's just entirely fraudulent charities. Like, we know this, like there'll be people who start up, various things on the internet saying they're going to do wondrous things for for people in need, and yet it's a con. We know these things exist, Singer. So that's why it's not immoral not to give. It's not immoral not to give because we never know. I mean, so many of these things are disreputable. And Singer's like, well, that doesn't get anybody off the moral hook because we can do research. And in fact, there are legitimate charities. Singer's not saying that UNICEF and Oxfam always have been or always will be legitimate. But at the time when he wrote these articles, he says these groups reveal their records. You can actually sign up with and go on these trips with these organizations. You can follow your money through the chain of hands until it gets to the child in need. There are plenty of charitable organizations that will let you do this. You can volunteer your time or your money or whatever and see for yourself, is it legitimate or not? Do the research. That Singer's argument is just letting us know that morality demands that we do this. But it also has the secondary obligation, namely that we would be acting immorally if we gave up our luxuries and then converted that to funds and then gave it to a fraudulent charity. We would have acted immorally. Why? Because we did not actually make sure that what we gave made it to the intended target. It didn't do the good. Remember, Singer's a consequentialist. So just attempting to achieve consequences, having good intention, that's what deontologists might let you get away with. But on a consequentialist picture, your actions actually have to produce the results. And so it's not, so yeah, sure, there's plenty of fraudulent charities. There's plenty of them. Singer doesn't deny that. But there's also many that are not fraudulent. And morality doesn't really care if it's going to take weeks and months of a person's life to figure out which ones are legit versus which ones aren't. It's just, that's the way morality works. Sometimes there is a buy-in cost to things, and morality is no different. That in order to build, say a vehicle, well, we have to buy the tools, we have to spend the time learning about how to use the tools, we have to accumulate the resources, we have to do all this pre-work to get ready to build that vehicle. Well, why would discharging our moral duty to give up access to help children be any different? Why wouldn't we expect that it would be just like any other worthwhile task? where we have to do a lot of research, we have to put a lot of time in, a lot of effort, we have to learn a lot. And then when we're ready, we go forth and start discharging this duty. But now the whole time we're getting ready, we're still doing something wrong if we're not getting rid of that luxury and excess to save these kids. But there can be a kind of delay pay thing, like we're just building up a big bill over the years that we're learning about charities and working through this to figure out which ones are actually achieving the consequences we're after. But and as long as we eventually save enough kids to make up for all that time that we weren't saving kids, on a consequentialist picture, yeah, you may be able to balance the moral books eventually. Singer's not going to say you can balance them in some kind of way. But in the end of the day, saying that there's frauds doesn't get anyone off the moral hook. It just identifies another moral responsibility, namely the responsibility not to give to frauds, but to give to those that are legit, and the responsibility to do all the work and time and effort it takes to figure out which ones are legit. So anytime someone says, I don't give because the charities, I never know which one is legitimate, all Singer's going to say is, well, why aren't you finding out which ones are legitimate? It doesn't get you off the hook. That's an excuse. That's not a solution. That's the way Singer's looking at this stuff anyway. It's interesting. Some people have said Singer's, and all of these objections, by the way, these are just objections people have raised and Singer's responded to for years. And I'm just, I'm just paraphrasing them and paraphrasing Singer's responses. I'm not making any of this up. This is things people have said about Singer's stuff. Yeah, and so too demanding is this idea that, Singer, your argument seems to demand that I give until I'm one step away from being as bad off as the people or persons I'm supposed to be helping. And that just can't be what morality demands or requires. Well, Singer's response, this is the gold standard of Singer responses. No one ever said that doing the moral thing was going to be easy. That's the key to Singer, is that anytime we look at what Singer's saying and we say, ooh, that's too hard, that's too demanding, just like with this charity thing, the responsibility to figure that out, what are good charities, what are bad, saying that I don't know which ones are good, all Singer's going to say is, well, it's time to go find out. Morality's still hanging over you every day. Well, that's kind of the way this too demanding. His response to that objection is going to be, well, whoever said being moral wouldn't require sacrifice? Now we have reached that point that I mentioned at the very first of this video. This lies at the core a lot of times of this knee-jerk negative reaction to Singer, is that many people tend to not want to think that morality would be extremely demanding. Most people seem to, at times, at least given what I've read and talked to people about Singer stuff, that most people that object to Singer object on this ground of it being too demanding. This tends to be underlying most all objections to Singer in one way, shape, or form, is people don't want to buy into the idea that morality could be extremely demanding. It could require that we run almost at a near impoverished level all of our days in order to save children from dying. And Singer's implying that. He's like, yes, morality could actually, in order to be moral, that is what could be required of you. I mean, the alternative is to just be immoral. But he says if you want to be moral, sometimes it could require enormous sacrifice. And then here's some examples. Like, no one ever said doing the moral thing was going to be easy. And so he could refer to any of these sort of martyr examples, like Christ's sacrifice on the cross to save everyone from their sins. Think about that. Give your life for all the sins of people you don't know, that's a pretty big sacrifice. And many would say that was a good or a right thing to do. It was the right thing for that person to do at that time. It would have been wrong for him to have not done it. So that would have been a moral obligation that was discharged, and it required a person's whole life. So, I mean, if that's the case, then morality can be very demanding sometimes to do the right thing or the good thing. Another one would be the folks who battled and were POWs in, like, say, the war with during World War II, or any wars where there's been genocide involved, and then where the POWs, the prisoners of war, have been extremely severely tortured and maimed, and yet they were fighting. If it's true that they were fighting for a good thing, if it's true, and this is all debatable, mind you, but the idea is, assume that you have a military force that is fighting for a good cause. And they're a soldier, and so it's like they have an obligation to do their best to see this good cause manifest or be secured. And then think of the ones who were captured as POWs and tortured. That was a tremendous sacrifice they had to make in order to try to achieve this good thing, trying to be moral, trying to do good. Sometimes trying to do good or be moral, according to Singer at least, can require enormous sacrifices, like being maimed the rest of a person's life, so they're not able to ever have that all much of a luxurious existence, where they end up having to go to, say, the VA the rest of their days and wait, long time lines, and and it's a long distance, and so they have their whole life tied up with the various forms of disability due to a military service to try to do good, assuming that's doing good, and so the idea is, why wouldn't we think that morality sometimes demands enormous sacrifice? Also, other examples would be people who have dealt with certain liberationist civil rights movements, people who have been beaten and tortured, and their families have been beaten and tortured and starved to death and abused. But then we tend to, as a culture today, look back at times and say, but those people were morally right. It was right what they were trying to do, and it was wrong what they were trying to prevent from happening. I mean, they were on the side of good, and that required whole lives of sacrifices. So Singer's like, why wouldn't we think that morality is in fact very difficult at times, and it requires sacrifice? Think about the comparison of sacrificing one's bodily functioning in a reliable way. They get maimed or something by, trying to fight the good fight, supposedly. Think about giving up your ability to function reliably the rest of your days, that level of sacrifice to do the right things, supposedly. That's an enormous sacrifice. Singer's going to be like, well, if we can recognize that as something morality might at times demand of us, then that's really giving up our luxury stuff is really minimal. You could still have normal functioning the rest of your life. You're just not able to buy a bunch of ice cream cones whenever you want it. You're not able to maybe while away hours at night on watching the television. You may not even have a television. You may not have a cell phone. You may not have a fancy car. The idea is, aren't those lesser sacrifices than like some that have been made for other people that were supposedly trying to do the right thing? If so, then no one ever said morality was going to be easy. So saying that it's too demanding to have to give up luxury items to save starving, suffering children, that doesn't do anything for someone like Singer. And it certainly What he's doing is challenging this assumption. This objection assumes that morality cannot be but only so demanding. And Singer's rebuttal to it is to say, oh, but if we think and look back at a lot of these examples of what morality required of people and that they lived up to, and we look at them as having done a good thing by making these tremendous sacrifices, then why even remotely think that morality isn't very demanding sometimes? It's not Singer's argument that's demanding, it's morality itself is. It's an interesting reply. And then there's this kind of objection. I don't think there's any purpose to keep reading through these. I've written out enough words, and there are many more. Let's see. There's some simple ones. But everyone needs to read through these and think about them this week. And we're going to talk about various parts of Singer's argumentation and these objections in this week's discussion. But there are others that are interesting. Some of them are really short, like I just don't like your conclusion. And Singer's like, well, just because you don't like my conclusion doesn't make it any less true. My reasons make it true, not a person's likes or dislikes. And this isn't Singer being snippety or, arrogant. Singer's not trying to be arrogant or pretentious or any of those things. These are just really concise ways of responding to objections like this. But I won't read through all of these, but just notice that there are many, 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 many. And make sure to read through and think about all of these, especially before this week's discussion, because these objections will come back around. And after reading through them, everybody in this class should have a very well-gained sense of how Singer sees the world, how he's going to reply dynamically back and forth to objections, how he thinks, how his argument works. And then when we're in discussion, we can talk about pieces of this and think about it more, which is really cool. This is a good week. It's a really good week with discussion. So, after spending, if you're still in disagreement with Singer, after you read all these objections, really think about it, and you've read his responses, but yet you're still not satisfied with Singer, it's always a good idea to ask yourself, why would you try so hard to try to refute what Singer's saying? I mean, one can always just accept, yep, I'm immoral. That's all you have to do. And if you happen not to live up to the requirement of giving up luxury to save kids, and in a consistent way, in this sort of extreme way that Singer's talking about, it's kind of like all one would have to do is say, yes, every time I choose to, say, watch television for 3 hours to be entertained, rather than taking that time and the money I spent paying for that television service and devoting it to saving the lives of starving, suffering kids, every time I did that, I was immoral. That's fine. That's fine. Singer would say, yep, that's right. That's all a person has to accept, is that, yeah, they've been immoral maybe all their life in this way. But many people do not want to accept that. And after you read through these objections and his replies and carefully think about his argument, think about what it is that still bothers you about it. If you're still bothered by Singer's reasoning, try to identify it and see if it is actually something in these objections that's just, if you think about it long enough, you'll probably find Singer's reply to some of these objections, or the objection itself actually captures what's bothering you. And then try to see, why is his response not satisfactory? Or you can just directly keep looking at his reasons and see if you can find some problem or flaw with them. But either way, he's always interesting. Singer is one of the more interesting people we encountered this entire semester, and I do hope people enjoy working with his ideas and talking about them. Let me know. Just send me an email if there's any questions about anything to do with Singer or this week's material. I'll always do my best to help, and I do look forward to this week's discussion. I do. It's a cool week. Singer is an interesting person. We've encountered many interesting people throughout this semester, but there's always a sort of special place for Singer. He's making a big bold set of claims, and it's always interesting to see how people think about it and what they have to say. But until this week's discussion,